Now, I suspect as well that the shamanic types are not only high in trait openness, which makes them dynamic and flexible in their personality restructuring, but also high in trait neuroticism, right? Because you can fall apart, so to speak, or transcend yourself because you're creative, but you can also fall apart because you're very sensitive to negative emotion. And it's a rather dreadful combination of traits to be very high in openness and very high in negative emotionality, because you keep sawing off the branch that you sit on and then suffering because of it. But that's also a pathway to transformation. It's often the case that people who are tormented by ideas solve problems. That was certainly the case, for example, of people like Darwin, who was obsessed with the idea that eventually made itself manifest as the theory of natural selection, despite his faithful and staunch Christianity. And that conflict also threw him into the underworld and tortured him. We'll talk about the creative illness with the close of this section on the shamanic transformation, because there is a pattern of descent and ascent that characterizes creative revelation, even among secular people, even among, atheistic scientists. Their discoveries still follow the ancient religious pathway, so to speak. Spontaneous vocation, so that would be temperamentally determined, let's say. Maybe even a slight tilt towards various forms of mental illness, manic depressive disorder, for example, or possibly even psychosis, would also increase the probability that someone would undergo something approximating a spontaneous, deep personality transformation. Many of the earlier investigators into the shamanic process made the presumption that it was emblematic of psychopathology. But the important consideration here, and you want to really keep this in mind, is that whether or not a radical transformation of personality is psychopathological or redemptive depends to a large degree on whether it's undertaken voluntarily or thrust upon you, right? And so one of the reasons to be courageous and forthright in your approach to life is so that you can encounter the snakes at a time of your choosing and on ground that you prepare, rather than waiting for them to get you in your, what would you say, as you cower under your bed. That's not a good strategy. It's also not the human strategy, not the fundamental human strategy, and it's associated with far greater levels of stress. This is a good thing to know. Imagine that I submit you and you to the same stressor, but you involuntarily and you voluntarily, and I measure your psychophysiological responses, let's say from the neuron level upward. What I'll find is that if you're in the condition where you're encountering the stressor voluntarily, an entirely different pattern of psychophysiological preparedness, including attentional focus, characterizes you than would characterize you doing it involuntarily. If you do it voluntarily, you're in challenge mode and you confront the stressor as if it's an opportunity. And that primarily produces motivation on your part in consequence of the positive emotion that marks progress towards a goal. If, by contrast, it's thrust upon you, kicking and screaming, then you're going to go into defensive prey animal mode, produce an overwhelming amount of cortisol, shrink, fail to pay attention, refuse to learn, petrify. That's why the basilisk in Harry Potter turns people to stone, by the way. Petrify like a rabbit being gazed at by a wolf, and forego the advantages of voluntary exploration, right? Okay, hereditary transmission. Well, like hereditary priesthoods, the vocation of shaman can be transmitted from generation to generation. That can be explicitly taught. So amongst relatively pre-literate tribal groups, the shaman and their apprentices often have a vocabulary that's 3 or 4 times greater than the typical vocabulary of the typical group member, because they're the storehouse of cultural tradition. Part of the cultural tradition is a description of the shamanic transformation process, the means by which it might be brought about, and the conceptualizations that allow it to be bounded and understood so it's not terrifying. Now, Eliade believed that most shamanic practitioners who weren't pathological engaged in their enterprise in a state of comparative sobriety, he believed that those practitioners who turned, let's say, to the use of psychedelics were an aberration from the fundamental stream. But I think he was probably wrong in that matter, given more recent investigations into the historic use of psychedelic substances. It's the case that psychedelics produce a physiochemical state that's quite analogous to what happens to you when you're highly stressed. That produces a neuroplasticity that facilitates learning. It disinhibits the effects of memory on perception, because most of what you see is what you presume rather than what's there, which is why the world is not as magical for you as an adult as it was when you were a child. That's reversed by psychedelic agents, which also produce this stress state, which can degenerate into an experience of hell, but that also facilitate learning. And so part of the technology of psychological transformation in the shamanic tradition is actually the usage and handling of psychologically active, hyper-powerful psychologically active substances. Psilocybin mushrooms, for example, or ergot, which is a fungus on rye, which contains LSD, or Amanita muscaria mushrooms, the fairy tale mushroom, red with white dots, which is also a powerful psychoactive chemical, although different chemically than the classic hallucinogens that was used particularly by the Siberian shaman. There are ongoing investigations now into the use of psilocybin, for example, for addiction cessation, for the treatment of the fear of death, which it appears to be successful at managing, which is the understatement of the century, if it's true. How can a physiochemical reaction produce cessation of death anxiety? This is among people who are terminally ill. It produces a spiritual transformation that reconciles people to their mortality. God only knows how, but that's part of what we're going to investigate. Most of that work was done at Johns Hopkins by Roland Griffith, who's a very solid, wise scientist who unfortunately recently perished of cancer. Hereditary transmission, that's what we're doing in this course, is the hereditary transmission of the shamanic vocation, just so you know. And personal quest. Well, what's a quest? A quest is the adventure of your life, right? Whatever you're doing and wherever you're going, you're after something, right? It might be something proximal. You're after something sitting here. You're after whatever it was that made you interested in coming here. And that's associated with whatever it is that you're interested in general. And that's associated with what? Are you here for good or for ill, let's say? Let's assume you're here for good. Well, then the specific manifestation of your interest in the topic at hand is a specific instance of the manifestation of your tilt in general towards the upward voyage, let's say, or the good. If you're not sophisticated, particularly if you're immature, that orientation towards the good will be proximal and very time-bound. You'll be only interested and compelled by what might happen in the very short term. That's how a child reacts, right? As you become increasingly mature, you're able to take a longer and longer view of what is motivationally significant, concentrating more and more on what's not only good for you right now, let's say from an emotional perspective, but on what might even be difficult for you right now from an emotional perspective, but highly beneficial in the medium to long run, or not specifically beneficial to you here right now, but beneficial in the long run for everyone that you love around you and for the broader community. And so you can think of that orientation upward toward the transcendent good as a manifestation of the maturation that makes you able to increasingly apprehend longer spans